You know, doing your duty is not always fun. We all have to clean toilets, and in January, we enter into a new tax year. And over the next several months, you'll be preparing your taxes or paying someone a large amount of money to pay the government money, which is strange that you have to pay someone in order for you to pay your taxes. Not that it's that tax person's fault, it's the complication of the tax system. But we all have things in our lives that we have to do, duties that we have to do, and we may not like them. And yet what we find is that so many of the duties that we do that we don't like actually make the world go around. Like cleaning toilets. Once again, not fun, but if you don't do it, then things start to back up, both literally and figuratively. What we're going to find as we look at Luke chapter 2, verses 21 to 40, what we're going to find is that Mary and Joseph, Mary's just had baby Jesus, and now what they have to do is they have to go do their duty. They have to go to the temple, and there is a process when a woman has a baby, when there's a newborn son. There is a legal process, a ceremonial process that has to be fulfilled in order for them to obey the law. And so if you would, open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 2, and we're going to read these various passages. But I once again just want to go over the background of all of what's happening here. Remember that Luke was a physician and partner of Paul, an early church leader. And what we have here in the book of Luke is a well-researched history using multiple sources and eyewitnesses. But what we've looked at so far are the various pregnancy narratives, the angel visiting both Gabriel and Zechariah and Mary, or the angel Gabriel visiting Zechariah and Mary, the Magnificat, Zechariah prophesies, John the Baptist is born, and then of course last week we read the story of Jesus being born, and then the shepherds and all of that stuff. So let's read verses 21 to 40.
When the 8 days were completed for his circumcision, he was named Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived. And when the days of their purification, according to the law of Moses, were finished, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, just as it is written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male will be dedicated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice, according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. There was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. This man was righteous and devout, looking forward to Israel's consolation, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he saw the Lord's Messiah. Guided by the Spirit, he entered the temple complex. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to perform for him what was customary under the law, Simeon took him up in his arms, praised God, and said, "Now, Master, you can dismiss your slave in peace, as you promised. For my eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and glory to your people Israel." His father and mother were amazed at what was being said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and told his mother Mary, "Indeed, this child is destined to cause the fall and rise of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed. And a sword will pierce your own soul, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed." There was also a prophetess, Anna, a daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was well along in years, having lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and was a widow for 84 years. She did not leave the temple complex, serving God night and day with fasting and prayers. At that very moment, she came up and began to thank God and to speak about him to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. When they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The boy grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was on him.
The first thing that we read is that Luke went through great lengths to demonstrate how Mary and Joseph did everything in fulfillment of the law. And in fact, he summarizes this section with a statement in verse 39. He says, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth." And so what did they need to do? What did they need to do to satisfy the requirements of the law? Well, first, in verse 21, on the 8th day, Jesus was circumcised according to the covenant of Abraham, and it was on that same day that he was officially given the name Jesus. And this was consistent with also John. John was named on that same day. Our culture, it's right when the kid is born. In their culture, it was on the 8th day. Greeks and Romans, sometimes on the 10th day. But furthermore, they were required also to consecrate him to the Lord according to Exodus 13. This is what it says. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whoever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine." And so if you were living under the Old Testament law and you had a child, the firstborn was special and it was consecrated to the Lord according to his own word. And Numbers 18 tells us that there was actually a redemption fee for the firstborn. There was a type of temple tax, and it was 5 shekels, which is about 100 ounces of silver. And so if you had a firstborn, then you would have to have him circumcised, and then you would present him to the temple, and you would pay this temple tax. Now, in order to do this, though, they would have to wait 40 days. Why is that? Well, the law prescribed that after a woman gave birth, there was a 7-day purification period, and then there was another 33-day purification period, and so she wasn't allowed to enter the temple. And so they would wait 40 days, and then they would go and make an offering according to Leviticus 12. This is what it says. It says, "And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering, and he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. And this is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean." Notice that there was an option for poor people. And in fact, instead of offering a lamb, what we find is in verse 24, they offered up 2 turtle doves. And so we know these were not wealthy people. Now, someone might ask, and I think this is a reasonable question, if Jesus was morally pure, why would they need to do all of this? He's a lamb without blemish. He's lived a sinless life. Well, first, some of these laws were ceremonial rather than moral. And a person could be righteous and still need to offer these sacrifices. But furthermore, Jesus himself existed under the law, and he still had to follow the regulations of the first covenant. Now look what Paul says in Galatians 4. "God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption." And so he was born under the law, and he lived under the law. And when Jesus was baptized, John the Baptist kind of argued with him and said, "Hey, you should be baptizing me." And he said, "No, I have to do this in order to fulfill all righteousness." And so living under this covenant, Jesus needed to satisfy all of the requirements of the covenant, not only the moral laws, but the ceremonial laws as well. He and his family had a duty to do, and they did it. Now, while at the temple, Mary and Joseph, they run into a man by the name of Simeon. And we know very little about him. We know that Simeon was a common name, and the scripture doesn't tell us much about him, but based on verse 29, we get the sense that this was an elderly man. Luke has a habit of giving compact character references, of saying, here's this person, and then giving a brief summary of their character. And in this case, we learn that Simeon was devout, he was righteous, and he was also filled with the Holy Spirit, which would have been unusual at the time. And the Spirit revealed to him, verse 26, that he would not die until he saw the Messiah, and this, in fact, was the Messiah that he had been waiting for. And that's why we sing Christmas songs like "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." So he took the month-and-a-half-old baby, this 40-day-year-old baby, and he blessed God, and he gave what I believe is another ecstatic utterance. And this is traditionally called the Nunc Dimittis, and it's called that because in the Latin, the first line are those two words. So he makes this ecstatic utterance about the baby, and he basically says that this baby is going to be salvation. Notice, the baby isn't going to bring salvation. The baby isn't going to bestow salvation. The baby is salvation. Verse 30, he is salvation. Verse 32, a light for revelation to the Gentiles. Verse 32, he's the glory for Israel. And so he is filled with the Spirit. He offers up this prophetic statement in the temple before the Mother, the Father, and the Son. Now, after this statement, I imagine he's done presenting the baby, and they're getting ready to leave. And he makes a few other statements that are, in a sense, prophetic, and they're also very dire. Verse 34, that he will cause the rising of falling and falling of many in Israel. What is he referring to? Well, we can only guess and look forward and see what happened, but my guess is that this is a reference to the power structure. You have this Old Testament covenant under which they live, and you have a lot of corrupt religious leaders that have taken over. They've added and subtracted, and they've taken their own traditions, and they've overruled the Old Testament covenant. And based upon the arrival of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and finally the death, burial, and resurrection, the power structure would be broken. And this was going to be the rising and falling of many in Israel. It also says in verse 34 that he will be a sign and that many will speak out against him or oppose him, depending upon your translation. And then finally he says in verse 35 that a sword will pierce Mary's heart. Now at this point, they've been parents of this guy for at least 40 days. And they've gotten a pretty good glimpse into the future of their son. They know he is the Son of God. They know he is the Messiah, and they know he's going to turn the world upside down. Shortly after this encounter, we meet the prophetess Anna. And once again, we know very little about her. Luke tells us that she's from the tribe of Asher, which is strange because that tribe disappeared some 722 years earlier. This was one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel when the Assyrians came down from the north and they wiped out the northern kingdom. The tribe of Asher was a part of that. And it must mean that she knew her lineage and her heritage, and she still claimed membership in this lost tribe that has been gone for over 700 years. But Luke also gives us another character reference, another compact reference here. We know that she is a devout and godly woman. So what do we make of this? What's the purpose of these two prophets? I mean, both prophets are aged, they're pious, they're related to the temple, and they're among those who wait for eschatological salvation. Both of them recognize that Jesus is the advent of God's redemptive intervention in world history. And notice that John the Baptist doesn't get any of this treatment. You see, if the Lord is worthy of honor and glory, and he is, then these events and these people lavish upon him the praise that he deserves to inaugurate his birth. And after this, they make the return to Nazareth in verses 39 to 40. So they're there at the temple, they complete their tasks, and they make their way back to Nazareth, which was about 100 miles. And my best guess is they've been gone for 2 to 3 months. Now, for some reason, Luke does not include the story of the Magi visiting and the flight to Egypt, which occurred when Jesus was possibly about a year old. But he does use a transitional statement, a statement to summarize his childhood, and really it's the only statement that we have about his early childhood. It's in verse 40. It says, "And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." So that's the story. And so we always ask the question, what now? What do we do with this story? I want to focus in on 3 things that are kind of not necessarily related, 3 things in the story. And the first one I want to look at is honoring duties and ceremonies. The example provided here is that Mary and Joseph provided, or rather satisfied, the letter of the law. There were certain things that the law prescribed, and they did all of them according to their specificity. Now, there is a trend in contemporary Christianity that focuses on our relationship with God. You hear statements like, God doesn't want a religion but a relationship, or I've fulfilled the spirit of the law, or I'm just going to love God. I will hear people say, just give me Jesus. And these may be partially true, but the Lord does in fact care that we follow his specific instructions. You remember the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it was told to Moses, this is exactly how you are to construct this ark. Every detail was given. And then they were told that you can't just use the ark like a weapon and no one is allowed to touch it except for the priests. And so there was a story where the ark is being transported and it's on the back. It looked like maybe some sort of, wagon, and one of the oxen slips and it looked like maybe the ark was going to fall. And so here's a guy, a random dude by the name of Uzzah, and his motives were good. He saw the ark maybe going to fall off, so he put his hand on it to steady it, and he dropped dead. You might say, well, yeah, but he was in a relationship with God. No. There were specific instructions, and this man lost his life because he did not fulfill them. Think about, I'm not a chemist, and I never took chemistry in high school or college, but I assume that you can't just start taking chemicals and mixing them together without it blowing up in your face. That there's a way to do it, and if you do it the wrong way, it could blow up. So these duties, these ceremonies, these things were not just stuff that was created by some stuffy old guys in a back room. How are we going to control the populace? These ceremonies, these duties, these were from the Lord himself. This is what you are supposed to do. When you have a child, this is what you do on the 8th day. When you're the woman who had a child, this is what you do on the 7th day. This is what you do after the 33rd day. This is how you do it. This is what you pay. These things were commands given to the people from the Lord himself. These were not created by legalistic Pharisees. So I asked the question, what are the duties and the ceremonies that the Lord demands of us today? We're no longer under the law, but we still have specific instructions on things that are duty-oriented or that are ceremonial. And the first one is baptism. Now, we don't have time to unpack a complete theology of baptism, but here are a few key points. Baptism means to dunk or to plunge. That's what the word means. And in fact, we look back at the early etymology of the word, and when they would take cloth, undyed cloth, and when they would dunk it into the dye to make it change a color, it was that same word used, baptizo. And they would dunk it in to the dye. We have historical records of a ship sinking in the ocean, and that same word, baptizo, was used to indicate going underwater. When Jesus was baptized, what did it say? It says he came out of the water. When Philip was witnessing to the Ethiopian, they said, hey, look, there's some water. Why shouldn't I get baptized? In other words, the word itself means to dunk or to plunge, and so it's always strange when I hear people being baptized by sprinkling. And you might say, it's not a big deal, it's a tradition. I'm like, it is a big deal. This is what the Lord has prescribed. You can't say, well, you're supposed to circumcise the child on the 8th day, but it's inconvenient, so we're going to do it on the 7th day. Or, you know what, it says to offer up 2 turtle doves, but I don't have the money for that. I found a dead sparrow. I'll just bring that in and sacrifice that. Or there's the Ark of the Covenant. It's not a big deal. I'll just go ahead and touch it. And yet, we're told that every letter of the law matters. And so in this case, when Jesus commands us to dunk or plunge in his name, my assumption is we should just dunk or plunge. Baptism does not save anyone, but it is the first step in obedience to following Jesus. It's something that is aligned up and prescribed for people who make the decision to follow Jesus. Now, I've heard people say, well, it's not a salvation issue. And that is among the worst arguments I've ever heard. Adultery is not a salvation issue, so let's just... Murder isn't a salvation issue. Much of the Bible is not a salvation issue. It's about living, honoring God, and living in a way that is wise. And so the command for Christians is, if you call upon Jesus as Lord, and you say, I'm following you, the first step of obedience is get baptized. Well, but I don't want to. It's cold. I don't like water. I don't want to be in front of people. It's embarrassing. And it's like, oh, okay. You just called me Lord and asked me to save you. And the first thing I've asked you to do is get baptized, but I guess it's too inconvenient. Now, I'm not trying to be mean here and bludgeon anyone, but the Lord does value these ceremonies, and it is a symbol of you going under the water, and the old person dies, and the new one comes to life. And here's the thing. In a lot of countries, with a lot of religions, you can believe anything you want, but if you get baptized, you are cut out from the family. You can believe in Jesus as Lord, no one cares. You get baptized, you're done. You lose your job, your family disowns you, you lose your inheritance, you're done. And so the temptation is to, I just believe in Jesus, and not to take that first step of obedience. So the second thing that the Lord commands us to do that might be considered to be ceremonial, we call these ordinances, is the Lord's Supper. And this is something that he commanded us to do in remembrance of him. It's a symbol of his broken body and spilled blood. And so when we partake, remember Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And so when we take that bread and we break it, it symbolizes the broken body of the Lord. And when we partake of the fruit of the vine, it symbolizes the blood that was shed. And he told us to do that in remembrance of him. Now, the frequency isn't mentioned. And so it's kind of hard. Some churches do it every Sunday. And I've heard people from churches say that you have to do it every Sunday. If you don't, that you're actually sinning. We don't take it that way. In fact, we have decided as an elder board, we're going to be just moving to a once a month Lord's Supper. It will be the first Sunday of the month, and it'll just be consistent, which is not starting this month. It will start February. But God commands us to take unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. And I've heard some story about some crazy youth pastor who was leading his youth group in the Lord's Supper, and he used Oreo cookies and milk, and he was trying to suggest that it doesn't matter as long as we're just obeying the Lord. It's only a symbol, and I would beg to differ. I would say, look, if he says to do it this way, I'm just going to do it this way. And if I get to heaven and the Lord is like, it didn't really matter to me that you used unleavened bread, then so what? Who cares? But if he says, this is what you do, that's what we should do. And so the example is in that upper room, they had unleavened bread and they had wine. And you might say, well, why aren't you guys serving alcoholic wine? Well, because in the ancient world, they had wine everywhere, and much of it could be fermented with high alcohol content, and some of it was fermented with very low alcohol content. And in general usage, it was kind of like grape juice with just a hint of alcohol in it. And so I don't think it's appropriate to serve booze here among a group of people, for various reasons. So if we were in, let's say Russia they go ahead and they invade Ukraine, and there's World War III, and we have some of our soldiers in the trenches, and they're over there in Europe, Northern Europe, and they're in a trench, and some Christians have gathered together as soldiers, and they're reading their Bible, and someone says, maybe we should do the Lord's Supper. And someone says, well, we don't have any bread. But we have some crackers. No, actually, we don't even have any crackers. All we have is bread, and we have the MREs with the water, and there's the grape flavor. And so they say we want to do Lord's Supper. To me, it seems reasonable. And I could be wrong, and some would disagree with me. But you're in World War III, you're in a trench, you're with some Christians, and all you have is some bread and some fake grape juice from your MRE. I would say, go ahead and do the Lord's Supper. You don't have any other option. But insofar as we can control it, we should be using unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. So these are two ordinances. These are two ceremonies that the Lord commands us rather to do. But here's another one, which is a duty, and that is tithing. If you look at verse 24, it says that Mary and Joseph offered a sacrifice, and in Numbers 18, there was a 5-shekel redeemer fee for the firstborn, and we might simply call it a temple tax. And so one of the duties that they had to do was to go and offer these offerings. And you might think, well, the burnt offerings, they get burnt up. No, not necessarily. A lot of the burnt offerings were used as income for the priest. And so you would bring an animal, and part of it would get burnt up, but then the rest of it would go to the sons of Aaron, and that's how they would live. Now, tithing is an odd topic because people don't want to talk about money. People don't want to be told how to handle their money. And people can't or won't tithe primarily because they are not in control of their own money. They don't have a budget, they're drowning in debt, they don't know where the dollars are going, and therefore they don't tithe. And a final reason might be that every once in a while you see a headline of a church that's abusing money or whatnot. And yet this is something that we're commanded to do. We're commanded to give generously so that we can have fully resourced ministries. And people might say, oh, well, I just love Jesus. I don't worry about all the man-made laws. No, these aren't man-made laws. These are from the Lord. Now, based upon multiple sources, people who actually give 10% make up less than 25% of the average congregation. Which means if on any given church in America, the church stepped up, got a hold of its finances, and started to give as commanded by the Lord, the average budget for every church in America would quadruple. So if you have a $200,000 budget based upon $200,000 in giving, if everyone stepped up and started doing this, then your church would go to an $800,000 budget, meaning every church would have more staff, more resources, more Bibles, more money sent to missionaries all the way around the world. Now you remember the story in Nehemiah 13 where the people stopped tithing. And you know what happened? The Levites, they went home. These are the people that served in the temple. They went home. Well, why did they go home? They have to eat. They have to feed their families. And they went home to work their fields. And Nehemiah was like, well, what are you guys doing? There's no temple. There's no worship. Nothing's happening because you aren't giving. So he chews everyone out, start giving again. They started giving, and then the Levites came back, and then the temple started to function again. And so the goal of giving is to have fully resourced ministries, and that's it. The church needs stuff that is not romantic. That's not like super awesome, like I gave this money to this mission and 5 million people were saved. Sometimes you need printers and ink. You need toilet paper. We've spent almost $15,000 in the last 3 years on cutting down dangerous trees that were going to kill someone. You need paint for the buildings. You need parking lot sealant and striping. Mary and Joseph, they came before the Lord and they fulfilled their financial and their ceremonial obligation. And these were rules that were not created by some legalists like Pharisees, but these were from the Lord himself. And so I think we should take seriously some of these ceremonial commands like the Lord's Supper, like baptism, and even like offering finances for a fully resourced church. Now, the next thing we see in this narrative is a prediction of suffering. Verse 35. Simeon's prediction is that Mary's heart, Mary's soul is going to be pierced by a sword regarding her own son. Now, one thing to note that's different in this, in the Greco-Roman world, swords were normally just glorified daggers. They were short. And the reason is it was based upon the combat style. So when you were a Roman soldier, you would have a very large shield, and you would have a spear, and that's the primary mode of combat. And then the sword was when things got into close, and you're going shield to shield, and you can't really stab someone with a spear when they're right there. And having a long sword doesn't help. So what you need is a short sword. So as your shields are up against each other, you can take the short sword and stab around, stab over, stab under. And that's the style of swords in the Old Testament and into the New Testament. In fact, we didn't really develop the long sword until metallurgy increased, if you look at Spanish armor. And so when you had armor that was really powerful, then you needed bigger, heavier, larger swords to pierce it. The Greek word that Luke uses here to describe this sword is a different word. It's not the standard little sword. It indicates a larger, a broader, and a double-bladed sword. And I don't know, how much to read into this, but all that to say that Mary's soul is not going to be pierced by the usual oversized dagger. Her soul is going to be cleaved by a large blade. Why is this? Well, one, she would spend 30 years waiting for her son to reveal himself as the Messiah. Now, I'm not saying this was suffering, but the miracles associated with the birth were grandiose, and then it was 30 years of silence, and this mother is probably just waiting and waiting and waiting for her son to reveal himself. And we find this in John chapter 2. It's kind of a funny story. The wine ran out, and the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, why would she be saying that to him? He's a guest. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, I wouldn't recommend saying woman to your mom. If you are the Son of God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, the Jesus Messiah, you can get away with that. But he says, my hour has not yet come. She's warning him, Jesus, they're out of wine. Come on. It's been 30 years. Let's do something. My time has not come yet. But that's small compared to the next thing, is that she would watch her son tortured and killed. Of course, she was not there during all of the kangaroo courts and the beatings, but we know that she was there at the end. John 19 says, standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, here's the thing about that. I can only speak theoretically on this topic, but it's not like it's easy when our parents die, but we know it's coming. We know it's coming. We know it has to happen. And there's a sense of community, because when someone's parents die and you're at that age, when parents are dying off, you have friends and they've gone through the same thing, and there's a sense of not even camaraderie, but at least someone knows what I'm going through. Now, in the ancient world, you would have 10 kids because you would know that 3 of them weren't going to make it to adulthood. But in American culture, it is not normal for a parent to watch his or her children die. And it's further intensified that this sort of death is very lonely because most people haven't gone through it. It's what's called disenfranchised grief. It's a type of grief that the average person hasn't experienced, and when you do experience it, then it's kind of like you feel all alone. And I won't pretend to know how bad this is, but understand that here's a mom watching her son being tortured and then being on that cross, and then he gives up his last breath, and then they still come and they stab him with spears, and I just imagine that large double-edged blade just slicing into her soul. The decision to confess Christ as Lord is the same decision to share in his sufferings, and we should not be surprised. C.S. Lewis said, I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that. And if you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. Jesus said this in Matthew 15. He said, if the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Christian, you need to understand, the world hates you. They hate what you believe. You are a bigot. You're a troublemaker. You stand in the way. You can name off all of these things. They hate your Lord, they hate you, and they hate his teaching. This is what Jesus says. This is directly from his mouth, and with that comes consequences. Now, we've been lucky in our country that our country was built upon the Judeo-Christian ethic, and we haven't experienced this hate. But it's happening all over the world, and it will only get worse here. Now, this is what Peter says. This is in a similar vein. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. He's saying, Christians, don't be surprised when this happens. Like this is some weird thing. It's not weird. This is expected. I'm reminded of the story of John Steingard, who was the former leader of the Christian band Hawk Nelson. In May of 2020, he came out as an atheist. This was a guy who grew up in a Christian home, grew up in a pastor's home, and was involved in professional full-time ministry for a long time, and he came out as an atheist. He confessed that I no longer believe in God, and I don't think I ever really did. Now, I don't want to pick on this guy too much. I think that was the right decision. If you don't believe in God, you should probably let your fan base, your Christian fan base, know. But he came out of the atheist closet when he was 37 years old. And again, I'm not trying to be judgmental, and maybe I am. I'll let you decide that. But I get frustrated with a person who has access to a Bible, who is in professional ministry, has access to millions of history books, is 37 years old, and functions as he's never read them. You see, one of the things that caused his atheism was that he went to Uganda. And while in Uganda, he was taken off guard. He was surprised by the suffering that children were occurring there in Africa. Now, if he was 18, maybe I'd have a little more room. But I want to ask, did you even read the first book of the Bible? The first two siblings in the history of the world. One killed the other. The book of Genesis alone, we have fratricide, murder, rape, attempted homosexual gang rape, lying, thieving, wars, betrayal, and even this strong statement in Genesis chapter 6, the Lord saw that the wickedness of men was great in the earth, and how much? Every intention of the thoughts of his heart were evil. How often? Continually. Every thought was evil continually. This is what the scripture tells us in the first 6 books of the Bible, that humankinds are rotten. And so how could you be a 37-year-old in Christian ministry and not even apply these chapters to your thinking and to show up and to be like, wow, there are children suffering in the world. I can't believe in God anymore. And my question would be, did you ever read about the killing fields, the Nazi Germany, the death camps, the massacre at Nanjing, the Armenian genocide, Stalin's Red Terror? You've never read any of these stories? And at 37, this is surprising you somehow? I remember seeing this horrible photo about the Armenian genocide, which most people don't even know about. But you have about 10 children sitting on the ground, and they're clearly starving to death. And this man's walking by, and he's holding bread, and he's taunting them with the bread and eating it and then walking by. And those children all starve to death. And all you have to do is pick up a history book to know that this is normal. I didn't say moral, but at the history of the world, this stuff happens all of the time. And we can't be surprised by it. We can't be surprised that children, that women, that men, innocents are suffering. Now, if your core value is the mitigation of suffering, your best bet is to reject Christ and quickly become an ardent follower of the world. Do you know who suffered the least during World War II? The men and women, and I don't blame them, I understand the temptation. The German men and women who said, yep, I'm going to take the Nazi flag and I'm going to put it on my front door, and when the soldiers go by, I'm going to say, Heil Hitler. I'm just going to go with the flow. I'm not going to make a stink. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to speak out. I'm just going to go with it, and Heil Hitler. That's how you reduce the suffering in your life, is figure out where culture is going, hop on, follow the stream. But the minute you say Jesus is Lord, now you're going against the stream. In Mary's case, there was great joy, great honor, but also great suffering. And you might say, well, is it worth it? Heck yeah, it's worth it. Because God does amazing things, and he promises that one day he will wipe every tear from our eyes, and that will end. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the nature of Jesus. If you look at verse 40 is a pivotal verse in the establishment of the nature of Jesus. Let me explain the concept here. Theologically, we have a term called the hypostatic union, and that is Jesus is simultaneously 100% God and 100% man. And if you are a math major, you're going to say that doesn't quite add up. It is an apparent contradiction. He is simultaneously 100% God, 100% man. Now, at the Chalcedonian definition of 451, it describes it well, and we're not going to read it here, but Kevin DeYoung at the Gospel Coalition, he points out that he is the only begotten Son, recognized in two natures, but this definition uses four negative statements about this union. The first one is that it is without confusion, meaning that it is not as though God and Jesus the man have blended together to create a third thing. So it's not that you took a couple of colors and you blended them and made them a new color. There's no confusion. There's also no change. So God did not cease to be God, and the Son did not cease to be human. And there is also no division. So it's not as if Jesus is half God and half man. And finally, there is no separation. There is a union of both the human and the divine in the person of Jesus Christ at the same time while being separate. So this is an apparent contradiction, and this is one of the primary foundations of our theology when it comes to the person of Jesus. We call it the hypostatic union. Now, look what it says in verse 40, because this verse gives us some information about the nature of Jesus. What does it say? It says that he grew. And this is important. What does this mean? Kids, Jesus had to study. He wasn't like this baby and all of a sudden he just knew everything, and he would go to class and the teacher would be like, okay, raise your hand, and like Jesus always had the right answer. That's not the case. He had to grow. He had to learn. He had to do everything that you have to do in school. It also says that he became strong. If someone becomes strong, it means previously they were weak. So he had biology like the rest of us. He had to. So people will confuse moral perfection with functional perfection. Jesus wasn't functionally perfect. He may have had, a bad leg, or he may have had some medical problem. He wasn't like a flawless picture of like humanity. He was a regular person. He was morally perfect, not functionally perfect. He had to do all the stuff. If he didn't brush his teeth, he'd end up with a rotten fish smell from his mouth. If he didn't floss, if he didn't exercise, he'd gain weight. If he ate poor, all of the stuff that humans go through. And then it says that he was filled with wisdom. The NASB says that he was increasing in wisdom. He had to do all of the work that we had to do or have to do to become godly men and women. Why is that? Hebrews 4, which tells us, we do not have a high priest who was unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So what do we find about this Jesus, this one who is fully man and fully God? What we find is that he can sympathize with our weaknesses because he's gone through everything that we have gone through, and yet he was without sin. I want to go back to this idea of duty for a minute. Sometimes duties can be boring. 30 years ago, I went to a church. I was a youth. I went to this youth group, went on a trip up to Jeunesse Park. And presumably they got my name and my address and my phone number, and they entered it into a database. Someone had to do that. Someone had to sit in front of a computer or have a ledger and put my name in there, and that can be boring and annoying. Why do we have to do this? And then after this trip, someone had to look at a list of all of these guests and be like, oh, I got to call these youth. I want to invite them to church. I want to invite them to Sunday school. And so someone did the boring, horrible paperwork deed of gathering my name and my address and putting it in a database and then later calling me and inviting me back to church. And guess what? I answered the phone and I responded and I came back. And I became part of the church, and then I confessed Christ as Lord and was baptized there because someone did their duty. And just yesterday on Christmas Day, I got a text from that same person who called me 30 years ago to follow up with me, and we texted back and forth, wishing each other a Merry Christmas. Like Mary and Joseph, the Lord is calling us sometimes to do things that we don't necessarily like. They're not romantic. They're not grandiose. They're not these awesome spiritual things. It's just the simplicity of doing what the Lord has called us